You haven't subscribed to the channel yet? Subscribe now. We have new stories every day. Now let's go. The Sound of Betrayal. Our family was the picture of suburban bliss. 2 beautiful kids, a comfortable home, and I thought a solid marriage. Sure, I worked long hours and wasn't always home, but it was all to give us the life we had. So when my wife Emily started complaining about feeling restless and bored, I did what any supportive husband would do. I tried to help. Emily had always loved music. Our house was full of vinyl records, and we even gone to a few symphony concerts together, though not as often as she would have liked. One evening, I suggested, half-jokingly, that she learn to play an instrument, something she'd always admired but never attempted. I read somewhere that it was good for the brain and thought it might give her the creative outlet she craved. Her eyes lit up like Christmas lights, and she agreed right away. "I'll look for a teacher," she said enthusiastically. I remember laughing and saying, "Just make sure it's an old lady who's been teaching piano for 40 years. She giggled, and we left it at that. About a week later, she announced over dinner that she'd found someone, a piano teacher named Mark who had fantastic reviews. He lived just a couple of blocks away, which was convenient. I jokingly asked if we should get a piano or maybe a keyboard so he could teach her at home. "Oh, no," she said, waving away the suggestion. "What if I don't end up liking it? It's better to go to his place for now. We can always get a piano later." I agreed, not thinking much of it. I was just happy to see her excited about something. Emily threw herself into the lessons with passion. She'd come home glowing, excitedly telling me about the pieces she was learning and how she could finally play a melody on her own. I loved seeing her so happy. But then, after about 6 months, things started to change. First, the lessons shifted to the evenings. At first, it was because of Mark's schedule, or so she said. But soon enough, it became a regular thing. I'd come home from work, expecting her to be there, but she'd still be at her lesson, often until late. She started dressing up a bit more, saying she wanted to look presentable for her lessons. I noticed a new perfume on her that I didn't remember buying. It was subtle, but it lingered. One evening, I got home earlier than usual, around 6 p.m. The house was empty, no note, no text. The kids were with my sister for the evening, so I decided to surprise her at Mark's place. I grabbed my coat and walked the few blocks to his house, feeling a little ridiculous for checking up on my own wife. But curiosity had gotten the better of me. Mark's house was a classic single story with large windows. As I approached, I could hear the muffled sound of piano music. I smiled, imagining Emily struggling through some complicated piece. But then, as I reached the front window and peeked in, the scene inside made my stomach drop. Mark's hands weren't on the piano keys. They were on Emily, tracing her arm, his face inches from hers as she sat on the piano bench, looking up at him with an expression I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't just listening to his music. She was leaning into him, completely absorbed. They were sharing a quiet moment inches apart, and then, like a punch to the gut, she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Couldn't process the sight of my wife tangled up with another man in the very spot where she was supposed to be finding joy in music. It felt like a twisted soap opera unfolding in real time. My legs felt like lead, and for a second, I didn't know whether to burst in or run away. Instead, I did what any rational, heartbroken husband would do. I crouched below the window, peeking through the gap between the curtains, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no mistake. They were kissing, her fingers tangled in his hair, the sheet music scattered around them like some kind of terrible romantic cliche. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but all I could feel was the weight of betrayal sinking in. My mind raced back to all the little signs I'd ignored. The evening lessons, the new outfits, the sudden enthusiasm for piano. She's just passionate about learning, I told myself. Right. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I went home, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. When she got home, around 9:30, her cheeks were flushed, and she was humming to herself, something light and cheerful. She smiled at me, and for a split second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. "How was your lesson?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Oh, it was great," she said, kicking off her shoes and pouring herself a glass of wine. "Mark says I'm really improving. I might even be ready for a recital soon." She took a sip, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Glad to hear it," I said, forcing a smile. For the next few days, I was a detective in my own home. I watched her movements, checked her phone when she was in the shower or nothing. She was careful, far too careful, but I'd seen enough to know. The evidence was burned into my mind, and it didn't matter what I found or didn't find. I knew. The final straw came one Sunday afternoon. I told her I'd be working late and parked a few blocks away and waited until she left for another lesson. This time, I was ready. I took pictures from the same window, my hands shaking as I captured the undeniable proof of what I'd seen. I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into thinking it was all in my head. When she came home that night, humming the same tune, I was waiting in the living room with a single picture printed out. It was of her and Mark, lips locked, the piano just a backdrop to their betrayal. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized what I'd seen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but cold. The confrontation was a blur of tears, denials, and excuses. She said she felt lonely, unappreciated, and bored. "Mark understands me," she said through sobs. "He makes me feel alive." I wanted to shout, to throw something, but all I could do was laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. "So, this is what finding yourself looks like," I asked, gesturing to the incriminating photo. "At least you're playing the piano with real passion." The divorce was messy, as divorces usually are. We fought over custody, over the house, over the vinyl collection that once brought us together. In the end, she moved out, taking half of everything, including the piano she swore she couldn't live without. I kept the house. It felt emptier without her, but I was glad to be rid of the ghosts that haunted it. The kids adapted quicker than I did, and they still visit their mom, who now lives with Mark. She tells them stories about